Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. Without a doubt, one of the most common rookie home labber mistakes is exposing your services to the public internet so you can access them when you aren't home. Now, when I say exposing them to the public internet, I'm not saying you put a VPN on your home network and expose that to the internet so you can access everything. No. I'm referring to you publicly forward, say, the SSH port or port 22 on your firewall directly to one of your devices, or the same thing with like an HTTP server or similar. Because don't get me wrong, not being able to access your home lab when you're not home definitely stinks, since you have no idea what's going on, which sometimes if there is something going on, you might want to know about that, so not being able to know kind of stinks. But blindly poking holes in your firewall to get access to all your services is definitely not the way to go. And in this episode, we're going to take a look at some of the ways that you can harden your infrastructure, as well as how you can reduce your attack surface in the process. Now, while we're talking kind of about home labbing here, this doesn't strictly apply to home labbers, but it also applies to professional home labbers, aka those who work in IT and managing corporate infrastructure is actually their job rather than just a fun side hobby they do in their free time. So with that's what we're going to get into. But before we get into that, let's get into this week's trivia question. So keeping with this trend of domain-related questions, what was the first and oldest domain ever registered? And to give you a little hint, this domain was registered back in 1985. So what was the first and is still the oldest domain name ever to be registered? And that is your trivia question for the week. Now, before we get into the rest of the episode, we kind of have some breaking news on our hands, at least as of the recording of this podcast. Depending on when you listen to it, it might be older news. But as of today, this news just broke today, and that is that the UK is forcing Apple to remove their advanced data protection from iCloud, thus essentially banning end-to-end encryption in the country. Now, in short, if you're not familiar with what Advanced Data Protection or ADP is, it's essentially a method of end-to-end encryption where before your device uploads anything to iCloud, it first uses its private key to encrypt the data before sending it off to iCloud. That way, I guess technically it'd probably be the public key rather than the private key, but you know what I mean. You have your two keys, your public key encryption, and you encrypt the data before you send it to iCloud. That way, only you can actually decrypt the data, and thus, even if anyone were to, try to capture your packets on the way to iCloud or even Apple themselves, all they would see is gibberish, so only you, with the key, would be able to decrypt that data, but the entire time between when it leaves your device and when it gets back to your device, it is fully encrypted. So, yeah, how many times have we talked on this podcast about why removing encryption, specifically end-to-end encryption, is a bad idea? So I guess we should take a little bit of a step back, though, because technically the UK didn't force Apple to remove ADP. That was Apple's decision. But according to some recent reports, The UK allegedly simply told Apple that they wanted a back door in the encryption process so they essentially could spy on their citizens. Apple, of course, said no and basically said, okay, well then no encryption for you then. So I guess props to Apple in the sense that they didn't cave to this asinine idea by the UK government to put a backdoor in encryption, because again, we've talked ad nauseum on this podcast about why putting backdoors in encryption is an absolutely horrendous idea. Because just because the backdoor is in there for you, that means the backdoor is in there for everyone else, and it's only a matter of time before other people figure out about your back door. See the not so long ago, that whole Salt Typhoon incident here in the United States where the Chinese allegedly hacked into the United States telecom networks and got so deep into the networks that the service providers didn't actually know if they were even gone or not, and they were using loopholes and backdoors that were put in there for law enforcement. So yeah, that was literally like 2 months ago or 3 months ago tops, something like that. Like fairly recently, we have an example of how a backdoor got abused and used against, its intended purpose. So just imagine that for encryption. I don't think we need to go into it all again. We kind of already started going off on a tangent here. But yeah, putting a backdoor encryption is a horrible idea. Now, on this matter of the whole ADP thing being removed, Apple had this to say on the matter, quote, Apple can no longer offer Advanced Data Protection, ADP, in the United Kingdom to new users, and current UK users will eventually need to disable the security feature. ADP protects iCloud data with end-to-end encryption, which means the data can only be decrypted by the user who owns it and only their trusted devices. We are gravely disappointed that the protections provided by ADP will not be available to our customers in the UK, given the continuing rise of data breaches and other threats to customer privacy. Enhancing the security of cloud storage with end-to-end encryption is more urgent now than ever before. Apple remains committed to offering our users the highest level of security for their personal data, and we are hopeful that we will be able to do so in the future in the United Kingdom. As we have said many times before, we have never built a backdoor or master key to any of our products or services, and we never will. End quote. Now, I think there's really two main points that I want to emphasize there that Apple said in their statement, which I think was pretty well said. But the first point I want to emphasize is the part where they said, quote, given the continuing rise of data breaches and other threats to customer privacy and enhancing the security of cloud storage with end-to-end encryption is more urgent now than ever before. That was kind of the first thing I wanted to point out. And then the last one is that one at the very end there, how they said that they have not and will never put a master key or any kind of backdoor in any of their products or services. Now, of course, because technically not all, but a lot of the stuff that Apple does is proprietary, so you do kind of have to take them at their word. But unlike some other companies, Apple generally has a pretty solid track record of adhering to these kinds of things when they say them, so we don't necessarily have a ton of reason to doubt them. But again, because everything's proprietary, you can't exactly look at the source code to verify it. But I'm inclined to believe that they are being truthful here, and I think what they said was very well said. Now, if you want to dive into the full article that I referenced here, I will have that linked down in the show notes. But yeah, this is something that is very sad to see. So anyone out there, if you happen to be in the UK and use iCloud, my condolences. But with that, let's move into this week's cybersecurity tip. This week's cybersecurity tip is don't just test your code for functionality. Now, what I mean by that is robust testing, like with automated test cases, can route out some of the most common security vulnerabilities, but it doesn't catch them all. Now, it's very important to have a very robust test suite. You, of course, want to test various kinds of edge cases to make sure your program can handle them and doesn't crash. Things like if you're expecting a string but you get an integer, or things like if you're getting an integer and you're expecting a positive number but you get a negative number. What happens if the integer overflows? Things like this, these kinds of edge cases that you might not necessarily think of initially, but you do have to take into account. So robust testing is definitely something that is important to have, and it can root out some of the most common vulnerabilities. Like a classic one is if you are expecting a string to come in and it's longer than you're expecting, and how do you handle a string that's longer than you're expecting? So that would be a great way to test, to make a basic test to make sure you don't have a buffer overflow on your hands. But that kind of static testing, I guess, if you will, can only go so far. And other static analysis tools like SonarQube, for instance, are great at catching some of the more common security vulnerabilities like hard-coded credentials, for example. But it's not necessarily the best for testing dynamic vulnerabilities, because if you have some kind of logic flaw kind of buried in your code, a static analysis tool isn't necessarily going to pick up on that, but kind of a more dynamic analysis tool where you can actually do like integration testing, that's where those can kind of come into play and essentially run test cases against your code while it's actually running. And this is an even better way to catch kind of more of those runtime bugs and vulnerabilities. And the beauty of this, too, is you can actually integrate these directly into your CI/CD pipelines along with your static tools as well. So you can essentially make an even more robust test suite to make sure that your code is as battle-hardened as it can be. Now, of course, I think it does go without saying that just because your code passes all of your test cases, the static analysis tools don't show any kinds of issues or vulnerabilities, and you did your integration testing tools and those didn't return anything bad either, that doesn't mean your code is 100% safe and has no vulnerabilities whatsoever, because there are things called 0 days, which are essentially vulnerabilities that nobody knows about until, someone eventually finds them, in which case they're not 0 days anymore. But yeah, so they're not going to catch everything, but it's definitely a great step to further minimize your chances of having severe bugs and vulnerabilities in your code before you go ahead and push it to production. And like I said, because you can integrate these directly into CI/CD pipelines or continuous integration, continuous deployment pipelines, it makes it basically a one-click, deployment essentially, where you push your code changes and then it goes through the process through the whole pipeline. And then if for some reason it fails in the pipeline, it just won't be deployed until you actually fix it and get everything passing. So yeah, that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Don't just test your code for functionality. Also make sure you do other kinds of tests like static analysis as well as integration tests. And automating that is even better. So I guess real quick before we get into the nerdy things that I got up to, there is this kind of nerdy adjacent thing that's not necessarily a nerdy thing, so I figured I'd kind of put it around the same spot, but not quite in the nerdy things segment. So as you kind of all know, the past couple weeks I recently moved, and every house, apartment, condo, townhome, etc. has its quirks. And recently I have discovered that my new place, the heater, at least in the master bedroom anyway, wants to compete with my server rack both in terms of heat output and noise. And I hear you saying, "Oh, but it's a heater, that's its job to make it hot." Well, yes, no dip Sherlock, but you don't understand what I mean by this. So if I don't close the vents in the master, so for context, the master bedroom, master closet, and master bathroom are essentially all connected. And each one of them has, in some cases, multiple vents for the AC and heating. So if all of them are open, it absolutely cooks in there. Like, it literally feels like an oven. And mind you, it's not like I have the heat set at like 75 or 80 degrees or something like that. No. The heat in my house currently is set to like the mid to low 60s, and it's still cooking up there. So much, in fact, that even with me closing every single one of the vents in the master bedroom, bathroom, and closet, it's still considerably warmer than the rest of my house. It basically feels like in my old place when I would go into my office/server room and close the door and sit in there for like 5-10 minutes and let the servers, aka the space heaters, get to work and start cooking the place. But yeah, so the other thing too was, not only did it feel very, very toasty, but it was confusing to me because typically, so for context, the master bedroom, bathroom, closet is on the second floor. And typically, at least in my experience, the upper floor usually has the most difficulty getting airflow to it. But it seems like that is the exact opposite in this place. Like, I don't know if, like, in the attic or something above the bedroom is, like, where the unit is. I honestly have no idea. But anyway, the other thing of it, too, is in addition to it essentially cooking everything, this is where the noise factor comes into play. So if you have all the vents open, yeah, it's kind of loud because there's a lot of air blowing through. But if you close the vents, I kid you not, the first time I did this and closed all the vents and the heat kicked on, I actually thought I had a laptop in the room and its fans just decided it wanted to max out, because that's what it sounded like. It sounded like computer fans essentially spinning like as fast as they can. Not server fans, but just like generic like laptop fans, which in fairness, some laptops, they can scream pretty loud and compete with some enterprise servers, at least when the servers are idling anyway. So had all the vents closed, and it sounded like, a laptop going at full blast. And for comparison, I did check going into the server room where my server is and checking the noise in there and comparing it to the noise in the master bedroom where the vents were closed and it was blowing really loud. And what I found was that the heat was actually louder than the server rack, which was kind of interesting. Granted, the Xserve wasn't running, so I might need to plug it in to fix that. But one of the things I also find funny here is normal people use decibels to express loudness. Me, on the other hand, I am a simple individual. I don't use complex units that some people don't know what they mean. I am a man of context, right? And I just follow a simple flowchart to determine how loud something is. First, I ask, is this sound or noise louder than my Xserve? No, then the noise isn't that loud. Yes, it is louder than my Xserve. Then I ask a follow-up question of, is it only louder than my Xserve when my Xserve is at idle? If the answer to that is yes, then okay, that's a decent noise level, but nothing like too insanely crazy loud. But if the answer to that is no, it is louder than my Xserve when it's at idle, then I ask another follow-up question of, is it louder than my Xserve with its fans maxed out? If the answer to that is no, then okay, that's pretty noisy, but I've heard louder. And then of course we get to the last one where yes, it is louder than my Xserve with its fans maxed out, in which case, oh boy, we got ourselves some serious noise on our hands. So a very simple flowchart to help you kind of break down how loud a noise actually is without having to worry about understanding units and getting into all those kinds of complexities. So I did not, unfortunately, have my Xserve plugged in to check to see if the Xserve was louder than the heat. But my guess is, based on kind of what I was hearing, the Xserve would be able to beat the heater. So nice try, heater, but you're going to have to, I guess, try again next time or something. I don't know. The Xserve, I'm pretty sure, has you beat. The only experience I think I've had currently where the Xserve actually got put in its place was that one time when, in my old place, when there was a pipe that kind of exploded in the wall one time when I wasn't home, and the walls basically got ripped open, and they had those, big industrial fans blowing to try to, dry everything out. When those fans were going, then the Xserve kind of got embarrassed and had to walk away with its tail between its legs. But aside from that time, the Xserve has basically beaten everything that's come its way in terms of consistent noise. Now, of course, if you put in something like a power tool or like, a food processor or some other like super loud thing like that, yeah, the Xserve might get beat then, but again, the Xserve is something that runs constantly, whereas those things only run for, generally speaking, short bursts. But anyway, with that nerdy adjacent thing, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So, this week, I learned the hard way that the Eris surfboard password requirement exists and what it is. So, for context, when I moved, I decided I didn't want to do this whole ISP router shenanigans anymore. I wanted to essentially, I guess, be a true home labber and bring my own. So, last week I talked about getting everything all set up and everything was working. But this week I discovered what the password requirements were for the Eris surfboard that I have, which I believe it's the G34, I think is the model. But anyway, I wanted to log in to the router/modem to essentially tweak some of the settings, because I noticed that some of my Pi-hole goodness was not being executed as well as it should, and then I kind of diagnosed that to being, oh yeah, the IPv6 is enabled, and it's not using the Pi-hole IPv6 address, so those ads are getting through, so I need to go in and tweak that in the router settings. So I tried to log in, and I was unable to. And I was like, okay, that's weird. So I also made sure to copy it down into my Bitwarden instance. So I copied the password from Bitwarden and pasted it into the web UI, and it still didn't work. And I was like, okay, I'm kind of tired with messing with this, so I just hard reset the modem with that little reset button on the back of it, and then I tried to go through the process of reconfiguring it, made sure to copy down the password exactly, and paste it in, went through the setup process, everything was good, no errors, no nothing, everything worked, and then I proceeded to go log in with the exact password I copied down, and it didn't work. And I was a little confused because I literally had it, I think copied into like a text file at this point, literally just to make sure I was, putting it in right. So copying and pasting didn't work. I was like, okay, maybe it's finicky. Maybe it doesn't like copy paste. Maybe I have to manually type it. That didn't work either. So I tried resetting it again and going through the whole configuration process. Still didn't work. After probably about the second or third time of going through this process, I started to do some digging online, and what I found was, apparently on some forums, there were some comments about the password requirements and how only certain special characters worked and others it just wouldn't accept them. So apparently, the admin password that I was trying to use had at least one, maybe it actually had two, of these special characters that were not allowed. Yet the thing that confused me was when I was going through the setup process, like I mentioned, there was no inclination that my password was invalid. Like there was no, message saying, hey, the password you entered was invalid because you used, an invalid character or anything like that. It just accepted it and moved on. But the problem was, because it moved on, I'm assuming somewhere on the back end, it did some kind of check to see like if the password was actually like legitimate, and it failed and didn't pass that check or whatever because it was invalid, so it couldn't be set properly. I honestly don't know, but this is essentially a classic example of a silent failure. Or in other words, technically the system worked because there were no error messages and there were no errors triggered, at least no user-facing ones anyway. And from the user's perspective, everything worked perfectly fine. Now, I guess maybe potentially under the hood of this Eris modem router thing, like buried deep in the OS, maybe there were some log files that got generated that said, the password's invalid or whatever. But you're not really able to get to that from the user perspective unless you maybe try to like hack into it and like get into the underlying OS. It's not something that you can do like from the web UI anyway. So essentially, it failed silently without notifying the user, but it just didn't work, but it didn't let you know that it didn't work. So it essentially just started gaslighting you at that point, basically telling you that your password's incorrect, even though it's the exact same password you entered and it didn't have any issue with. But technically, from its point of view, the password that whatever it thinks the password is, because it failed to set your password, is not the password that you entered. So because it failed to set the password you entered, when you enter your password, it doesn't match the password it has on file, which who knows whatever the heck that is. But yeah, so technically it's not wrong, but at the same time, it's basically gaslighting you, saying, hey, your password's wrong, even though your password is most assuredly not. So yeah, that was quite the fun time I had. I think that, I don't remember how long that actually ended up taking me, but it was probably like a solid like 30 to 45 minutes or something like that of me just kind of like messing with this thing. But it's all working now as far as I can tell, and I was able to log in and update the settings that I wanted to update, so everything's all good now. But yeah, that was quite the adventure this week. So getting into kind of the main point of the episode, which is the hardening of infrastructure and how to reduce your attack surface. So I guess kind of starting off here, we're kind of addressing the question of why security matters for home labs and self-hosted services, and some of the risks that are kind of involved with self-hosting, because exposing services to the internet can lead to things like data breaches, botnet infections, ransomware, and other kinds of malware that you definitely do not want on any of your systems or infiltrating your home network. So as I kind of alluded to, we're basically kind of going to go over the basic understanding of what an attack surface is and how to reduce it, as well as some best practices for not only home lab security, but just general infrastructure security as well, and some kind of tools and strategies you can use. So the first thing we kind of have to address is understanding what an attack surface is and why it matters. So essentially what an attack surface is the sum of all of the entry points an attacker can exploit to get into your system. And of course, the bigger the attack surface, the more vulnerabilities that potentially could exist and the more avenues that a threat actor would have to gain access to your system. Now, this is typically why when it comes to hosting services, you generally want to divide up your services onto multiple servers rather than having them all on one single server, because if you have them all on one single server, of course your attack surface is much larger because you have a lot more applications running on that server that potentially could be exploited. Now, this is where things like containerization and virtualization come into play, because while yes, you can be running multiple virtual machines on a single hypervisor, each one of those virtual machines is an isolated environment, so even if one of those virtual machines were to be compromised, you can't necessarily infect the rest of the hypervisor unless you exploit like the Spectre Meltdown vulnerability, which has since been patched. But essentially what that was able to take advantage it was essentially a side channel attack that took advantage of the CPU prediction algorithms or whatever, so branch predictions, so it could essentially get information about what was actually going on in the CPU and other processes and all that kind of goodness. But yes, usually having things either in containers or in virtual machines isolates them, so if the system gets compromised, it's not like every single one of your other services also goes down if ransomware happens, right? So that is why you want to split up all your services into either individual containers or individual virtual machines in order to reduce your attack surface. Now, some common attack vectors, kind of looking at the home lab perspective in self-hosting, is exposing things like SSH or RDP or VNC or any kind of remote management software or any kind of web UIs to the public internet. Those are probably some of the most common ones in terms of home labbing, and SSH for sure. If you're exposing any kind of like RDP or VNC to the public internet, I'm very sorry. I don't know why you're doing that. Web UIs, I can kind of understand why you would want to do that. Like if you wanted to be able to manage to your Proxmox cluster when you're not at home, but that's also a really bad idea, because if you can get access to it from the public internet without a VPN, so can anyone else, and that if a threat actor were to gain access to your Proxmox web UI, you're basically cooked there. So long to all of your services. And some other common attack vectors are things like unpatched software. So if you're not keeping up with your updates, which you should, that can be another means that a threat actor can get in. Weak authentication, using either default passwords, not strong passwords, or not using some kind of multi-factor authentication, or you have some kind of poor network segmentation going on. You have IoT devices or Internet of Things devices with personal devices, as well as your home lab servers, all on the same network and being able to talk to each other. Generally not a good idea. You kind of want to isolate those things, as we've talked about in other episodes. So here's some kind of real world examples of, these attack surfaces and security failures. One of them being the Capital One data breach from back in 2019. So essentially what happened here was there was a misconfiguration in an AWS S3 service, which led to some fairly large data theft. Now, in Capital One's case here, the misconfiguration was in the web application firewall, or the WAF. And for whatever reason, it was assigned too many permissions, i.e. they allowed more things that the buckets could basically get access to than it actually needed. So again, not following the principle of least privilege. And remember, the principle of least privilege doesn't just apply to users, but also applies to your services and applications as well. So the short version here is there was a server-side registry or server-side request forgery attack that was used against the web application firewall to trick it into running commands that it should never have been able to run in the first place, including being able to talk to the metadata service. Now, the metadata service is essentially responsible for handling or handing out all the temporary information to the cloud server, which also includes things like current credentials from various security services in order to gain access to resources in the cloud which, the server would have or give the server access to. So essentially, by talking to this metadata server, the attacker was then able to access this metadata and thus access the credentials. And I think you can see how the story goes from here. So another one that's kind of more of an ambiguous one that's probably happened multiple times is a kind of a more home lab perspective. This isn't necessarily one specifically, but I'm sure this has happened more than once. Exposing Proxmox Home Assistant or some other kind of web interface to the public internet without any kind of multi-factor authentication. Now, you don't have to go too far looking at forums and whatnot to see people talking about how they publicly expose their Proxmox instances to the internet, which I disagree with that methodology. Even if you're using something like a Cloudflare tunnel, and if you're unfamiliar or similar, and essentially what that is it's a way to expose services on your private network without necessarily poking holes in your firewall. But I still don't like this idea because if someone knows the domain, they can still access your service without any kind of other authentication. And if they can break your username password and you don't have multi-factor authentication set up, you're essentially still cooked anyway. So that's why I am a huge advocate of, if you want to have access to your home lab remotely, to have some sort of VPN solution set up in order to, get access to those things rather than exposing things to the internet. And if you do want to expose services to the internet, like say you want to host your own web server or something for your personal website, you totally can do that and do something like a Cloudflare reverse tunnel, but you want to make sure that server is on its own VLAN, segmented from the rest of your network. So in the event that it gets, compromised in any sort of way, it's not going to infect the rest of your network. So the last one I kind of wanted to touch on here is what was called Print Nightmare from back in 2012, which was essentially an exploit that enabled remote code execution through a Winter's printer spooler, which basically gave any threat actor that was able to perform this remote code execution system-level privileges. So in essence, they could basically do whatever they wanted to. So yeah, not very good. So when it comes to hardening your home lab and just your infrastructure in general, there's a couple essential kind of security practices that you should definitely be following. So the first one, and kind of one we've already touched on a little bit, is minimizing your public exposure. So this is putting everything that you want to have accessible, or basically everything in your network, behind a VPN or a virtual private network. So using something like either WireGuard, Zero Tier, OpenVPN, Tailscale, or something like that to essentially put everything behind the VPN, so you have to go in through the VPN in order to be able to access things. And if you've ever worked in a corporate environment, that's basically how you can access corporate resources, is you log in through the corporate VPN, which gets you into the network, which then allows you to access whatever you need to do. Another thing you can do is you can also use some kind of like reverse proxy with authentication. That could work as well. But again, you'd want to minimize what you expose publicly to the internet, because the more that's exposed publicly to the internet, the larger your attack surface is, and you want to try to minimize that as much as possible. So when it comes to minimizing your public exposure, what you do not want to do is expose things like your NAS, Proxmox, or Home Assistant, or anything else like that to the open internet, or relying on default ports like port 22 or port 80 or 443 or something like that for attackers to be able to scan and thus try to access an exploit. And also, just in general, don't be opening up ports on your firewall unless you actually have a reason for them to be open. Generally speaking, I would say have every port closed except for maybe a port for your VPN, if that's the way you're doing your VPN. But yeah, otherwise, don't be opening up ports. And if you do have to open up ports, don't use the default ports, because if you use the default ports, that kind of gives threat actors an idea of what you might be running and then how to potentially exploit whatever is running there. So yeah, don't do that. The next one, which we've kind of talked about before in other episodes, so I'm not going to harp on it too long, is using network segmentation and firewalls. So kind of like we've touched on, making sure you separate your Internet of Things devices from your home lab services and your personal devices using things like VLANs or virtual local area networks. So essentially all your IT devices are on one VLAN, your home lab services are on another VLAN, and then your personal, devices are on a third VLAN. And even further than that, you could, further divide up your home lab services or even any of these services into multiple VLANs, but just kind of as a high level, your IoT devices should be separate from your home lab, which should be separate from your personal devices. So using something like pfSense, OpenSense, or WRT or something like that to create network isolation is a great way to do it. Also, depending on what kind of network switch you have, you can also configure this at the switch level too. So kind of in contrast, what you don't want to do is allow your IoT devices to communicate with your home lab or other personal devices, and then kind of going back to the firewalls thing, leaving unnecessary ports open, or not appropriately inputting the access control lists or ACLs between the VLANs. So even though technically they're on separate VLANs, they can still talk to one another. So that's one thing you do have to watch out for when you're working with VLANs, is configuring those ACLs, because just because things are on separate VLANs doesn't necessarily mean my home lab VLAN can't talk to my personal device's VLAN and vice versa. But you can put in ACL rules to basically say, hey, I don't want my personal devices to talk to my home lab, but my home lab can talk to my personal devices, for instance, or my IoT devices shouldn't be able to talk to anything else, but both my home lab services and my personal devices can connect into the IoT devices to, check up on them and see what's going on. Things like that. So ACLs are definitely something you want to make sure are configured if you kind of go through that VLAN route. So the next thing is to lock down authentication, and that some things you want to do here is to make sure you're using SSH keys rather than passwords. And kind of in the same vein here, ensuring that the root user is disabled from being able to log in general, because one, if you're exposing an SSH server to the public internet, which you shouldn't be, I guess the only caveat there is, depending on how you have, if you're using a cloud environment, depending on how you have your cloud environment set up, you may have SSH exposed there. Although if you do some kind of like virtual private cloud that you have to VPN into, then you shouldn't have SSH enabled to the public internet. But if you just say have one server up there, having to VPN into it just to SSH into it is maybe a little overkill, but of course, security over convenience, right? The more convenient something is, the less secure something is. But regardless, even if you don't publicly expose SSH, you should absolutely disable the root user from being able to be logged into, because you should not be logging in as the root user. And one thing that is interesting though, is if you do have a server that publicly exposes SSH to the internet, it's very interesting to check the logs to see what people are trying to do, like as far as logging into your server, and root is something that's very common. So completely just denying that access. And of course, if you're using SSH keys, doing that certificate authentication, it basically prevents them from brute forcing guessing passwords. So that's definitely a plus. Also enforcing 2FA wherever possible, and of course making sure you're using strong passwords and hosting them in something like Bitwarden, and just using two-factor for just basically all your services that you host. And things you don't want to do is rely on single-factor authentication, like just relying on passwords, or even worse, reusing passwords across different self-hosted services, because in the event that a threat actor were to infiltrate your network, if you use the same password for everything, boy oh boy are they going to have a field day, completely wrecking you and making you have a very bad day. So then the next one I think is kind of a no-brainer, but it kind of goes without saying, is to keep your infrastructure updated. Now, whether this is you have kind of auto updates enabled, or you have some kind of script or Ansible playbook or something like that to, run on a periodic basis to make sure your servers are always up to date, and you're installing all your security patches. Another thing you can do too is you can use watch lists to monitor the various CVEs for the different types of software you use. So whenever there's like a new vulnerability in a piece of software you have, you can monitor that to see when the patch comes out to make sure you're updating as soon as possible. And depending on what the vulnerability is and how you're hosting the service, potentially maybe even taking that service offline until you can get that patch installed and updated, just to ensure you don't get hacked through some kind of vulnerability there. So of course, in contrast to that, what you do not want to do is ignore outdated dependencies and just kind of using abandoned projects without any kind of security updates or patches. You definitely want to make sure that you're keeping up with those. So the next thing I kind of wanted to touch on is some security tools and stuff for both self-hosting and just kind of infrastructure in general. And some of this is going to be stuff we kind of already touched on, like firewalls and network monitoring. So we kind of already touched on the firewalls perspective, using something like an OpenSense or pfSense or OpenWRT or something like that. But also using something like an intrusion detection system or intrusion prevention system, something like Snort, for instance, to basically detect for funkiness going on in your network and alert you. Now, of course, you do have to be mindful of that because at least initially, you're probably going to get a fair number of false positives. But over time, as it kind of like learns what normal traffic is, it'll, kind of do a better job. Another thing that is helpful for, ensuring, security and everything is having some kind of monitoring or logging solution, because it's great to know and, be protected and all that stuff. But if for some reason a service goes down or, there's some wonky activity going on, you kind of want to know and kind of be able to monitor, that, right? Because if your server, like your hypervisor, for instance, is, say, chugging along at like 10%, CPU utilization, and then just out of nowhere it spikes to 100% and you're not doing anything, probably something's going on. So having some kind of monitoring solution to be able to check on that is something that is very good to have. So things like Graylog, Splunk, Uptime Kuma, things like that for both logging as well as monitoring when your various services go down or any kind of log messages that might be generated. The next one is kind of access management. So one great way to kind of ensure you're keeping up with, strong secure passwords and two-factor authentication like that is self-hosting a service like Bitwarden in order to manage all of your passwords for you. Because the one thing that I really like about, now this isn't sponsored or anything, but one thing I do like about Bitwarden is I should also say you can use Bitwarden without self-hosting it. But the reason I like the self-hosted option is because I know where my passwords are stored and only I have access to them. And the only way I can have access to them is if I'm on my home network. So I don't have to worry about really any kind of data breaches going on and my passwords leaking out there in the ether. Now, granted, of course, I also have a pretty robust, strong password on my Bitwarden vault. But also just having that and being able to generate, strong, secure passwords. And, if I want to do two-factor codes, I could, but I have a separate app for that because One thing you also want to keep in mind when you're doing two-factor is you don't want to have all of your things in one spot, because if someone compromises, say, like, so one of the things that people will sometimes say is you shouldn't have, one of the reasons why doing SMS verification, for amongst other reasons why SMS is bad, is because if you're, say, trying to log into something on your phone and you get an SMS text message on your phone, it kind of defeats the point of the two-factor because it's the same device. So for instance, if I'm, logging onto a service on my laptop, having the two-factor method, on my phone, I actually have to have both devices in order to log in, rather than it all being in one spot, if that kind of makes sense. So having that kind of separation of things in order to further make your accounts a little bit more secure. Now, the last one I kind of wanted to touch on here in this section is backups and disaster recovery. So some of the common ones, like especially in my use case, I use Proxmox for my hypervisor. So things like creating snapshots or virtual machine backups is something I do fairly regularly. I have a schedule to auto backup all my virtual machines, and it has saved my bacon multiple times, mainly because I was trying to do something dumb and didn't think that it would possibly go wrong, and then of course it did, and then I had to rely on my backups. But it's not just things like virtual machines as well, right? It's other things too, like any of your other servers, which in the case of if you're using a hypervisor like Proxmox, backing up your virtual machines is kind of backing up your servers, but also, backing up Proxmox in general. But other things too, like backing up your laptops, your phone, any other workstations you have, just to make sure that if something were to happen to them, you can restore that data. And then, of course, having, following the 3-2-1 backup strategy, making sure you have at least one copy off-site on 2 different mediums, and you have 3 copies of the data. Yeah, now, granted, I'm still being a hypocrite here because I have not fully situated on an off-site backup. I know, feel free to rage at me in the comments or whatever. I do have a plan in place. It's just I haven't executed it yet because it's at the point where my NAS has so much data on it, like it has multiple terabytes worth of data on there, and doing some kind of offsite remote backup, like say uploading it to like a cloud service, like an S3 bucket or something, with how slow my upload speed is, I mean, we're talking like at least a week and a half, if not potentially 2 weeks or more, depending on how things go. So I'm really just making excuses at this point. It's really something I need to do sooner rather than later, probably, as seen with my whole paranoia when I was trying to move. Now, thankfully, nothing happened. Nothing bad happened. I didn't lose any data, and I did take extra precautions. And technically speaking, I did have a 3-2-1 backup at that point because I did have a separate copy of the data, 1 still in the NAS, and 2, I had the copy I was carrying with me while I was traveling, so I knew I at least had that copy, so it was in 2 different locations, and we were all good there. And it's funny, when I actually had a legitimate off-site backup, I felt so much better about my data. So yeah, definitely something I need to actually get my butt in gear and start working on. But enough harping on that. Let's get into the next thing I wanted to talk on, which is kind of a use case, more of a practical type of a situation. So the scenario here is you're self-hosting some things, like maybe you're self-hosting Home Assistant, Bitwarden, and say a media server like Jellyfin. So a case before you kind of go through this hardening process is you'd have, your Home Assistant Bitwarden exposed directly to the internet because, of course, when you're out and about, you want to be able to control the things like your lights and your thermostat and things like that when you're away from home. And of course, when you're away from home, if you run into an instance where you have to create a new account or you need access to your accounts, of course, you're going to want to be able to access your Bitwarden. But because you just want the convenience, you don't have two-factor setup, and you didn't do anything fancy with your firewall, so you just kind of plugged holes directly in it to go directly to those services, and all your devices are on a single VLAN. So that would be the not so good way to configure your home lab. The better way to do it, like kind of once you go through this hardening process, would be you place everything behind a VPN. So whether that's WireGuard, OpenVPN, Tailscale, or otherwise, you place everything behind the VPN, so you have to go through the VPN in order to access your Home Assistant, your Bitwarden, your Jellyfin server, whatever. Then you also take the extra step of enabling multi-factor authentication for both your Home Assistant and your Bitwarden access. So you can't just, only log in with a password. You need something else. Like maybe it's biometrics, maybe it's, a two-factor code, whatever the case may be. And then, of course, you take the extra precaution of creating VLANs in order to separate your IoT devices from your media server from your other various admin services. So the key takeaway here is if you're running a home lab, you're also running a mini enterprise network, so treat the security as a priority, not an afterthought. Because one of the reasons why we love home labbing is because we are essentially able to operate our own mini data centers and running our own enterprise level networks, and we should treat them as such, right? Like we should be making sure that our services are hardened, where not everything is just kind of all loosey-goosey, blah, blah, blah. We want to make sure that we're taking it seriously, just like we would be if this was actually our job. So kind of to wrap everything up here, security from kind of the cybersecurity realm of hardening your services is about reducing the risk, but not eliminating it entirely. Since one of the things that you have to remember here is, and we've touched on this before on the podcast, is the only secure system is the one that is completely turned off and unplugged. That is the only secure system. But once either of those things is no longer true, i.e. it gets plugged in and or powered on, it is no longer secure. So the point of security is to be adding the layers of Swiss cheese, as I like to say, on top of each other to try to mitigate the potential of having holes as much as possible. By, the more pieces of Swiss cheese you stack on top of each other, the less likely you are to have a clear path from the top of the cheese down to the bottom to get through everything. So kind of in this, some things you can do to, kind of audit your services is to audit, your publicly exposed services. So using something like Shodan or Shields Up to test your network and test your services to make sure that nothing is exposed that you don't want to be. Also setting up network segmentation to making sure all your devices are not all on the same network. You have VLANs in place to separate things. And then, of course, implementing things like multi-factor authentication and making sure if you do set up things like logging or monitoring solutions, you actually pay attention to those logging or monitor solutions, because they can be in place, but if they're just, logging and spitting messages into the ether and you're not checking them, you might as well not have them anyway. So by kind of applying these ideas, and reducing your attack surface, and applying some of these best practices, it will not only help you whether you're a developer, IT professional, or just a general self-hoster, but it'll also make your infrastructure that much more secure. But again, it won't make you bulletproof, because again, there is no silver bullet when it comes to cybersecurity, because if there was, we'd all be using it. And again, the only fully secure system is the one that's fully unplugged and powered off, but that's not very fun to tinker with because you can't do anything with it. So So that, I think, is basically going to wrap this episode up. But before we close, we should get back to our trivia question for the week, which is, what was the first and currently the oldest domain name ever registered? And again, the hint here is that it was registered back in 1985. So again, what was the first and currently the oldest domain name ever registered? If you said symbolics.com, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. And if you enjoyed this episode, definitely be sure to leave it a rating and review and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And we covered a lot of good stuff here, so definitely be sure to share it around with your friends, family members, coworkers, whatever, anyone you know who has a home lab or manages infrastructure in general. And if you have any questions about this episode or have any topics or ideas for future episodes, you can definitely shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. Love to hear from you. You can click the link down in the show notes below as well. Also, if you're on YouTube, you can just drop a comment down below and I'll be able to see that there. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bool nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.